The Malamaco Channel runs deep and straight through the southern Venetian Lagoon, and arriving by water along its western edge in the gray middle of an afternoon, the first thing that appears off the port side is not a city, but an island, low, almost flat, its silhouette barely raised above the surface of the surrounding lagoon, the way all of these islands sit, not rising from the water so much as resting just above it, held between the tidal flat and the open sky in an equilibrium that looks from a distance as though it could be tipped either way. The island is Poveglia. It sits approximately 500 meters from the Lido shore to the east and 4 kilometers south of the main Venetian island cluster, and from the water approaching along the Malamaco Channel, it appears, in the first moments of sighting, as simply one more low mass of land in a lagoon full of them. Reed grass at its edges, a line of trees above the grass, a few stone structures visible through the vegetation, and the whole thing unremarkable in its dimensions and its position until the boat draws close enough to resolve the details. The channel itself is one of 3 primary deep water passages connecting the Venetian Lagoon to the Adriatic, the Malamaco. Its depth makes it a working maritime corridor, the route that cargo vessels and larger ships use when moving between the open sea and the port facilities that serve this part of the Adriatic coast. And the passage runs so close to Poveglia's western shore that a ship moving through it at a moderate speed will hold the island in clear view for several minutes before the channel curves away to the north. This proximity is not incidental. It is a spatial relationship that has defined the island's administrative uses across several centuries, its position alongside the primary southern approach to Venice, giving it a surveillance function that no other site in the lagoon quite matched. An island through which everything entering from the south had to pass, a place positioned to watch and to hold. Approaching from the south, the first distinct structure to resolve itself from the general low line of the island is at its southernmost tip, octagonal. Its walls built of stone in the early 19th century during the Napoleonic period, when the channel it overlooks made it a strategically practical site for artillery, covering the Malamaco approach. The fort, called locally the Octagon, sits where the island tapers and narrows to meet the water, and it holds its shape with a clarity that the structures behind it no longer manage. The walls are intact. The geometry of the octagon is visible from a significant distance, its angular stonework rising above the waterline in a way that reads, from the channel, as purposeful and maintained, even when seen close enough to observe that vegetation has established itself at the base of the walls, and that the interior, if interior there is, remains inaccessible. It is structurally more complete than anything else on the island. It has resisted, or simply outlasted, the processes that have undone the brick buildings behind it, and from the water it presents itself as the most legible piece of architecture, on a site where legibility has been progressively complicated by time and by the things that grow in the absence of maintenance. Behind the octagon, moving north along the island's body, the structures change in character, brick rather than stone, late 19th and early 20th century in their general form, institutional in their massing and their arrangement. Long roof lines, or what were long roof lines, now interrupted at intervals by gaps where the timber has given way and the sky has come through. Aerial photographs taken by journalists and urban explorers in the decades since the island's last institution closed its operations show the compound from above with a clarity that ground-level observation cannot always provide. Rectangular building footprints, their edges still precise, their interiors progressively filling with the irregular dark shapes of vegetation that has entered from below and from the open roof sections, a process that works slowly and without interruption, and that has, across the intervening decades, produced a condition in those rooms that is neither fully interior nor fully exterior, not collapsed, not standing in the way a maintained building stands, something between, a structural frame through which the outside has begun to move. Poveglia covers approximately 17 hectares in total. The island consists of two distinct land masses, joined by a narrow isthmus and a man-made embankment, and seen from directly above, in those aerial photographs taken since the 1990s by various observers with access to aircraft or later to camera-equipped drones, it presents a roughly triangular silhouette. The northern section holds the surviving buildings, the hospital compound, the bell tower that rises above the tree line, the administrative structures, and the subsidiary buildings that served whatever institution was operating at any given point in the island's managed history. The southern section tapers, it narrows as it extends toward the water, and its character is different from the northern part, less built, more open, the ground lower and less stable at its edges, the vegetation, not the vegetation of an abandoned institutional garden, but the vegetation of something closer to genuine wetland, reed grass and sedge moving at the lagoon's edge, the ground uneven and in places waterlogged, where the island's edge meets the tidal flat at anything less than high water. At low tide, the southern spit exposes its full form. The shoreline here is not the clean edge of a built embankment, but an irregular line where the island's land simply meets the lagoon's shallow water in a transition of exposed sediment and reed grass, the ground darkening as it approaches the waterline. A narrow band of tidal flat appearing at the island's edge and then disappearing again when the water rises. The sediment here is darker than the gray-brown of the surrounding lagoon floor. Its color is noted by multiple observers who have approached the island by small boat and landed on this section of shore, a darkness that is not simply wetness or shadow, but something in the soil's composition, a quality that is visible in the photographs taken by those observers, and that persists across images taken at different times and in different light conditions. The ground itself carries something in its composition that the eye registers before the mind has formed a question about what it might mean. The isthmus connecting the island's two sections is narrow enough that from a position standing on it, as documented observers have described, water is visible on both sides simultaneously. To the west, the Malamaco Channel. To the east, the quieter waters of the internal lagoon, shallower and less trafficked, the surface broken occasionally by wading birds moving through the reed grass at the island's margins. The isthmus is covered in grass, a growth that has established itself through the cracking and displacement of whatever stone paving was once laid across it, and the stone is still visible beneath the grass in places, its original purpose legible even in its current condition, a path that connected two sections of an island that functioned for a long time as a working site, a place of managed movement between its parts, now managed only by the grass and the slow hydraulic work of water seeping through the joints between stones. The lagoon's horizon from this position, from the isthmus with water visible on both sides, is low and wide. The Venetian Lagoon is a shallow body of water across most of its extent, 2 to 3 meters in the navigable channels, considerably less across the broad tidal flats that make up much of its area, and this shallowness gives the horizon a flatness that the open sea does not have. The surrounding islands that are visible from Poveglia are themselves low, their tree lines not much higher than the tree line of Poveglia itself, and between them the water and the sky share a quality of gray-blue light that changes through the day in ways that photographs record but do not entirely capture. In the morning, the light comes from the east, from behind the Lido and the western face of the island. The face that the Malamaco Channel runs alongside sits in a relative shadow, while the eastern shore holds whatever warmth the autumn or winter sun can deliver to this latitude. In the afternoon, the situation reverses. The channel side lightens, and the hospital compound, facing partly westward through its broken roof sections, receives the last of the afternoon light through the gaps in its structure with an evenness that illuminated rooms would not have. The narrow canal that runs along Poveglia's western edge, the edge nearest the Malamaco Channel, was a deliberate engineering feature rather than a natural waterway. It was part of the island's quarantine function. This channel, designed to ensure that vessels arriving from the Adriatic through the Malamaco Passage came within close visual range of the isolation facilities on the island's western shore before proceeding north toward Venice. A ship entering the lagoon from the south would pass the island on its port side. The channel would bring it close enough for those on board to see the buildings, and for those in the buildings to see the ship. A mutual visibility built into the geography, the kind of practical arrangement that a republic managing maritime traffic through epidemic periods would engineer as a matter of administrative necessity. Ships and island in deliberate proximity, the watching and the watched, the arrangement held in the physical dimensions of the waterway itself, and persisting in those dimensions long after the institution that required it ceased to operate. A cargo vessel moving through the Malamaco Channel in the late afternoon, and they do still move through it. The channel still serving its function as a deep-water passage for commercial maritime traffic, passes Poveglia's western shore at the same distance that vessels have been passing it for several centuries. The ship's hull moving at a working pace, unhurried, the island holding its position off the starboard side of any vessel heading north or the port side of anything moving south toward the Adriatic. The brick buildings visible through the trees, the bell tower above the compound, the octagon at the southern tip, its octagonal geometry still reading clearly from the water. The crew of a passing cargo vessel in the present moment sees roughly the same silhouette that a ship's crew saw in the 18th century or in the 19th. The outline of the island, the structures on it, the channel between them, narrowing to the width that the quarantine function required. Time has changed the condition of the buildings. It has not changed the channel, or the island's position within it, or the view from a ship passing at the distance the waterway provides. The hospital compound occupies the northern section of the island with a footprint that is, even in its current state, large enough to establish the scale of what was once a working institutional facility. Long ward buildings, each one running roughly parallel to the others, their brick facades still standing along their lower sections, while the upper portions and roof lines have deteriorated at varying rates depending on their exposure and the condition of their original construction. The aerial photographs document this variation, some buildings more intact than others, some sections of roofline still holding their original profile, while neighboring sections show the open dark gaps where the timber beneath the tiles has rotted through and the structure has given way. These photographs, taken from above at intervals across roughly 3 decades, show the process in something approaching time-lapse, the gaps widening over successive years, the vegetation inside the affected rooms growing denser as the light and rain enter from above, the rectangular building footprints remaining legible in their outlines, while their interiors undergo a progressive transformation from closed institutional space to something that functions more like a greenhouse or a courtyard or a ruin in the specific sense of a structure that has been returned. Slowly and without ceremony, to the processes that buildings interrupt when they are built and resume when they are left alone. The fig trees are the most visible agents of this process. Fig trees establish themselves in the smallest available cracks in masonry and paving, their root systems capable of exerting considerable lateral pressure as they grow, and Poveglia's abandoned compound has provided them with decades of undisturbed access to every joint and gap in the hospital's floors and walls. They are visible in the aerial photographs as irregular canopy shapes disrupting the rectangular lines of the building footprints. At ground level, in the photographs taken by journalists and urban explorers who accessed the island at various points in the decades following the hospital's closure, the fig trees appear inside rooms, growing upward through the floor, their trunks established where a tile has given way or where a drainage channel has created an entry point for root growth, their branches reaching toward the light, coming through the damaged roof above. Some of these trees are large enough, in photographs taken in more recent years, that their root systems must have been working at the hospital's floor structure for a considerable time. The root and the floor in a relationship that has only one direction to run. The elderberry shrubs and the invasive grasses that have colonized the paving stones and pathways throughout the compound are less architecturally assertive than the fig trees, but more pervasive. They appear in every documented photograph of the hospital's exterior spaces, the courtyards, the pathways between buildings, the areas that were once maintained as the organized outdoor spaces of a functioning institution, as a continuous ground cover that has erased the distinction between path and non-path, between maintained surface and uncultivated land. The paving stones are still there beneath the growth. The documentary record established by the photographs of the 1990s and 2000 shows them still in their original positions, cracked along the grout lines where frost or root growth has worked at the joints, but not displaced, not collapsed, simply covered by the succession of annual and perennial plants that have taken the opportunity offered by an unattended surface. The same process that operates on any untended ground, working through the decades of the island's closure at the same rate and with the same indifference to the specific history of the place it is working on. From the water, approaching on a gray afternoon from the south along the Malamaco Channel, none of this interior detail is visible. What is visible is the silhouette, the low line of the island, the tree line above the reed grass, the rooftops of the hospital compound in the northern section, showing above the trees, the bell tower rising above the compound, the Otagon at the southern tip, holding its octagonal clarity against the water, a shape that reads as an island with buildings on it, ordinary in its dimensions, ordinary in its position within a lagoon full of islands with buildings on them, ordinary in the way that any piece of geography looks from a sufficient distance before the specific details of its particular history and condition have been registered, the channel running alongside, the distance between ship and shore, narrow, deliberate, a spatial arrangement that was built into the island's function and that persists in the present as a physical fact, regardless of whether the function it served still operates. The light shifts on the lagoon in the late afternoon. The gray-blue of the water takes a warmer tone as the sun approaches the western horizon, and the buildings on Poveglia's northern section catch this light through their broken roof lines in a way that fully intact buildings would not. The open sections of the hospital compound's upper stories become briefly luminous as the afternoon light enters from the west, illuminating the interior walls of rooms that have been open to the sky for decades, the light moving across surfaces that were once the interior of a functioning institution and are now simply the inner faces of walls standing in open air. The fig branches visible through the roof gaps cast moving shadows across these surfaces when the wind moves through the lagoon. The shadows of branches on the interior walls of a building that no longer has a complete roof, a detail that is specific to the island's current condition and to this time of day, visible in a certain kind of light and gone when the light changes. The octagon at the island's southern tip catches the same late afternoon light on its western faces, the stonework taking a warm tone against the colder green of the vegetation established at its base. Its walls are complete. The geometry of the octagon is visible from every angle available from the water, each of the 8 faces presenting a different orientation to the light and to the observer on the passing vessel, the structure turning in the observer's perspective as the channel carries the ship past it and the island's relationship to the viewing angle shifts. A fort that was built to cover a channel, holding its form while the channel continues to carry its traffic and the afternoon light continues to move across its walls, the way afternoon light moves across any west-facing stone, in any lagoon, in any autumn. The island sits in the southern Venetian Lagoon at approximately the position it has occupied since the lagoon's geography was last significantly reshaped by the engineering works of the Venetian Republic. Its 17 hectares are what they are, not large, not small, by the standards of the lagoon's inhabited and formerly inhabited islands, a workable area for the various functions that the island's position made it useful for across the period of its managed history. The 2 land masses joined at the narrow isthmus, the northern section with its buildings, the southern section tapering toward the water, the octagon at the tip, the channel to the west, the quieter internal lagoon to the east, and the low, wide horizon of the lagoon in every other direction, the water and the sky exchanging light across a surface that has no features tall enough to interrupt the view for any significant distance. In the documentary Kunstreacher on the Kredinglatorijief, in the documentary 8 Fab, bekalakt krasselpiets or mind bekalakt by every tets. Van Blatt Potsperwensianman's works im a lot when him. Photographs taken in the years following the hospital's closure, photographs from the 1970s and 1980s when the island was newly abandoned and the closure was still a recent administrative fact. The interior of the hospital wards appears in the particular condition of the fits that has stopped being used without being emptied, the furniture remaining, the institutional fittings in their original positions. The paint on the walls intact in those early years, not yet showing the long peeling strips that would appear in later photographs as the roof damage progressed and the interior climate of the wards became more like an exterior climate. And in some of those early photographs, taken within the first decade after the closure, on the floors of the wards, through the tiles, through the drains, through whatever gap or crack was available, the first evidence of what was already working at the floor from below. A root, a slender shoot finding its way upward through a joint between tiles, pale from the absence of light in whatever passage it had navigated to reach the surface, arriving at the floor of an abandoned hospital ward with the same complete indifference to history and use and institutional purpose that any root brings to the surface it is working through. The fig tree beginning its long conversation with the floor, undisturbed and undefended, beginning to answer. The island rests. The lagoon moves around it with its tidal rhythms, the water rising and falling across the reed grass at the southern spit, the channel carrying its occasional traffic along the western edge, the light moving through the day across the walls of the abandoned compound. Something grows inside the wards, where there was once a floor, and before that much earlier, before the buildings were built, or the island was formalized into institutional purpose, simply ground, something growing in a place that has been left alone, working steadily and without urgency through the tile and the substrate beneath it. following the available light upward through the spaces that the building's construction once closed, and that time and weather and the eventual departure of the people who maintained it have gradually and completely opened again. In the year 421, the lagoon was not yet Venice. It was a shallow, reed-threaded expanse of water and low land sitting between the Adriatic and the Italian interior, its surfaces shifting with the tides, its islands barely distinguishable at certain hours from the water surrounding them. The people who arrived that year came by small boat, crossing from a mainland that had become unreliable, carrying what could be moved and leaving behind what could not. Poveglia was among the islands they found. It was low, as all the lagoon's islands were low, and it sat in the southern reaches of that water with the open Adriatic not far beyond its eastern edge. The settlers who came to it in that period were not making a permanent declaration. They were finding ground that could hold them for a while, in a landscape that offered the particular protection of difficulty, the difficulty of reaching islands in shallow water, of navigating the channels without local knowledge, of mounting any serious military movement against people dispersed across a watery geography that rewarded those who understood it and confused those who did not. The name Poveglia carries its own uncertain history. Some researchers have noted the possibility that it derives from populus, the Latin word for poplar, which would place its naming somewhere in the Roman period, when the island's position along the coastal navigation routes made it a natural waypoint between the Adriatic ports and the lagoon's interior passages. A place named for its trees suggests a place that had already been noticed before it was settled, a landmark recognizable from the water, marked by the particular vertical line of poplars against a flat horizon. Other derivations have been proposed, none of them firmly established. The name survives. The trees, if there were poplars, do not. What remains is the word itself, carrying the ambiguity of something old enough that its original meaning has gone soft at the edges, though the word itself has stayed hard and specific across many centuries of use. The lagoon in 421 was a place people were arriving at, not a place people were building toward any particular future. The mainland Roman administrative order had been in the process of dissolution for several decades, its provinces increasingly difficult to defend, its infrastructure requiring more coordination than the surviving institutions could provide. The populations that moved onto the lagoon's islands during this period were not unusual in their situation. They were part of a broad, gradual movement of people away from places that had become exposed and toward places that offered natural defense. What made the lagoon distinctive was the particular quality of its protection. Shallow water cannot support the kind of military operation that requires cavalry or heavy supply lines. The channels between the islands were navigable to those who knew them and treacherous to those who did not. The tidal fluctuations altered the landscape twice a day in ways that could render a crossing safe in 1 hour and dangerous in the next. For people willing to live with that variability, the lagoon was a place that worked in their favor. Poveglia's early settlers would have found an island already shaped by the particular conditions of lagoonal geography. The soil was the accumulated sediment of the lagoon, fine, alluvial, built up over long periods by the movement of water, carrying material from the rivers draining the Veneto interior. The island sat at the edge of one of the lagoon's major navigational channels, the same channel that would later be formalized as the Malamocco Passage into the Adriatic. Boats moving between Venice and the open sea would have passed within sight of Poveglia's shores, as a matter of course, the island visible from the deck of anything moving through that stretch of water. This was not incidental to the island's later history. Its position made it a place that could be seen, a place that could watch, a place that sat at the junction between the protected interior of the lagoon and everything arriving from outside it. A community on Poveglia in the early medieval period would have looked from a distance, much like any other small lagoonal settlement. Fishing boats pulled up along the shore, the kind of low, practical architecture that the lagoon's island communities built, close to the water, oriented toward it, using what materials the lagoon and its trade routes made available. The island's inhabitants would have known the channels around them the way any fishing community knows the geography that feeds it, which is to say completely in the particular sensory way of people who navigate a landscape daily and whose lives depend on reading it correctly. The passage of 9 centuries of ordinary habitation leaves traces in the land that are hard to recover once the habitation ends. The worn paths, the kitchen middens, the foundations of buildings, the modifications to the shoreline that make a place more useful for mooring boats or drying nets. Poveglia held those traces, layer by layer, as the decades accumulated into centuries, and the community continued its small, particular life at the edge of the navigational channel. The first 9 centuries of that life are sparsely documented, as the lives of small communities in the medieval period generally are. What survives in the written record are references, mentions, the kind of incidental appearances that a place makes in documents whose primary subject is something else. Trade agreements, ecclesiastical records, military dispatches. The island appears in these materials as a known location, a point of reference, a place that people navigated toward and away from without particular remark. This is what ordinary existence in a small community produces in the historical record, not its own documentation, but its trace in other people's transactions. The 9 centuries between 421 and 1379 are held in that kind of silence, not a silence of absence, but a silence of the unremarkable, the quiet of a place where nothing happened that anyone thought needed to be written down with particular care. The War of Chioggia changed that. In 1379, the long-running competition between Venice and Genoa for control of Mediterranean trade routes reached a phase of direct military engagement in and around the Venetian Lagoon itself. The Genoese fleet, allied with other forces hostile to Venetian commercial dominance, managed to seize Chioggia, the substantial port town at the lagoon's southern end, approximately 8 kilometers from Poveglia. This was an unusual and serious situation for Venice. The war had arrived not at a distant theater, but at the lagoon's own edges, threatening the navigational corridors through which the Republic's commerce moved. Poveglia, positioned along the Malamaco Channel with a direct line of sight south toward Chioggia, became militarily relevant in a way it had not been during its 9 centuries of ordinary fishing community existence. The Venetian military used the island as a staging and observation point during the conflict. Its position along the navigational channel made it useful for monitoring movement toward and from the seized port, and the island's existing infrastructure, whatever form that took by the late 14th century, provided a foothold in the southern lagoon at a moment when the Republic's control of that geography was under direct pressure. The military use of Poveglia during the War of Chioggia was one of the island's first formal appearances in the Venetian state record as a place of strategic rather than simply residential significance. What had been, for 9 centuries, a fishing community's home became, for the duration of a naval conflict, a military position. The difference was administrative as much as physical. The island had not moved. Its relationship to the channel had not changed, but the category into which the Venetian state placed it had shifted, and that shift would prove lasting. The conflict was resolved in Venice's favor, Though the process of resolution was complicated and took several years of blockade and countermaneuver before the Genoese forces were dislodged from Chioggia, what followed the conflict's end, from Poveglia's perspective, was more consequential than the conflict itself. The Venetian Senate issued an order directing the island's remaining civilian population to relocate. The destination was the Giudecca, a larger island within the Venetian urban complex, closer to the administrative center of the Republic, integrated into the city's commercial and residential life. The displaced inhabitants were reportedly compensated with certain civic rights in their new location, a recognition that the relocation was compelled, that something was being taken from the people asked to leave, and that the state acknowledged some obligation in that exchange. The order was, in the administrative language of the period, a practical decision. The island was being reassigned. The people living on it were in the way of what the state intended to do with it next. What it feels like to receive such an order is not something the Venetian Senate's records address. The document is a direction, not a conversation. The people of Poveglia, fishermen and their families, people who had inherited their place on the island from their parents and their parents' parents, people whose knowledge of the surrounding channels and tidal patterns was accumulated over lifetimes, received word that they were to leave. The boats that came to collect them, or that they found for themselves, would have arrived on ordinary mornings. There would have been a last day of ordinary life on the island before the process of departure began. There would have been decisions about what to take, the movable things, the useful things, the things that mattered for reasons that were not entirely practical. There would have been a morning after which none of them returned, and after which the island held only the physical remainder of their presence, without the presence itself. The move to the Giudecca placed the island's former residents inside the city they had always been adjacent to. Venice and its lagoon community had been in relationship across the centuries of Poveglia's habitation. Trade, fishing rights, ecclesiastical connection, the ordinary commercial and social exchanges of neighboring communities in a shared watery landscape, but moving from a small separate island with its own discrete geography to a place that was effectively a district of Venice was a change of category as much as of address. The Giudecca was not Poveglia. It did not have the same relationship to the water, the same daily experience of living at the edge of a major navigational channel, the same quality of being a distinct place rather than an extension of a larger one. The civic rights offered in exchange for the relocation were real, but they were of a different kind from the rights that come with simply being where you have always been. Poveglia, after the depopulation order, was a place with infrastructure and no people. The buildings the community had constructed over 9 centuries remained standing. The houses, whatever communal or religious structures the island held, the modifications to the shoreline that made it useful for boats, the walls and paths and arrangements that any functioning community leaves behind in the physical landscape. These structures did not immediately deteriorate into ruin. Abandonment is a slow process, particularly in a sheltered lagoon environment, where the salt air works on materials at its own pace and vegetation advances at the rate of unmaintained ground rather than the rate of active destruction. For a period following the 1379 order, the island would have looked from the water substantially as it had looked before, the same silhouette, the same structures, the same relationship to the channel. What was missing was not visible from a distance. The Venetian state's administrative reassignment of the island moved it into a new category of use. It became a checkpoint and signal post for ships entering the lagoon through the southern passages, its location along the Malamocco Channel, visible from the Adriatic approaches, making it suitable for exactly the kind of monitoring and communication function that the state needed at that point in the lagoon's geography. The people who worked this function were not settlers. They were state employees, temporary in the way that people assigned to administrative posts are temporary, present for the duration of their assignment, and then replaced or withdrawn. The island's residential character, 9 centuries of a community whose relationship to the place was generational, inherited, embedded, had been replaced by something functional and impermanent. The state needed a position in the southern lagoon that could watch and relay. Poveglia was the position it had. This transition from residential to administrative use is a common enough pattern in the management of small strategic islands throughout the medieval Mediterranean. Islands that had been home to fishing communities were reassigned to military or logistical functions as the strategic needs of the surrounding states shifted. The communities that had given those islands their residential character were moved or relocated, or simply found that the conditions supporting their presence had been altered by decisions made in administrative centers they had little direct access to. The specific circumstances varied, the conflict that triggered the reassignment, the specific function the island was then given, the nature of the compensation offered to those displaced. But the general shape of the transition was familiar. A place defined by its community became a place defined by its function, and the function was determined by whoever controlled the relevant administrative apparatus. The empty buildings on Poveglia after 1379 would have served the island's new administrative occupants as shelter and workspace, their original domestic purposes replaced by the practical needs of a monitoring station. A building is a building. Its walls keep weather out regardless of who lives inside it or what they are doing there. The houses of the fishing community became the quarters of the signal post staff, and the modifications that community had made to the landscape became the infrastructure of its new, reduced use. The lagoon continued to lap at the same stones. The channel continued to move the same vessels past the same shoreline. The visibility of the island from the water remained what it had always been, clear, useful, specific. What had changed was the nature of the human activity associated with that visibility and the size and permanence of the human community that sustained it. The century and more between the 1379 depopulation and the island's eventual formalization as a quarantine station in the following century was a period in which Poveglia existed in its reduced administrative state, present in the record as a location, as a point of reference in navigational and diplomatic documents, as a property of the Venetian state being held and used rather than settled and inhabited. This is not an invisible period. Places that are being used leave documentary traces of a different kind from places that are inhabited, but they leave them nonetheless. The record of Poveglia's checkpoint and signal post function is thin but real, the way the records of logistical infrastructure generally are, present in accounting documents, in maintenance records, in the inventories of state property that any functioning bureaucracy generates when it is managing physical assets in multiple locations. What the documents do not capture is the quality of the place during this period, the experience of the staff assigned to it, the way the island felt in the morning light or in a November fog, the sound of the channel moving alongside its western shore, the way the lagoon horizon looked from whatever structure the signal post used for its watching. Documentary records are not interested in these things. They are interested in whether the function was being performed, whether the assets were being maintained, whether the costs were within acceptable parameters. The atmosphere of a place, the particular quality of its light, its sounds, its physical relationship to the water surrounding it, is precisely the kind of information that administrative documentation does not need and therefore does not preserve. The 9 centuries between the island's first settlement and its enforced depopulation are held, in a sense, in the same kind of silence as the administrative period that followed. Both are documented sparsely. Both leave traces in other people's records rather than in their own. The difference is that one silence is the silence of ordinary life proceeding without incident, the unrecorded daily movements of a fishing community in a lagoon that was becoming something extraordinary around them while they went about their particular, unremarkable existence. And the other is the silence of absence, the quiet that settles into buildings when the people who maintain them have been directed elsewhere. These are different kinds of silence. The first is the silence of things happening. The second is the silence of things having stopped. The lagoon's wider community would have continued to pass Poveglia on its regular routes, the familiar silhouette visible from the decks of fishing boats and trading vessels moving through the Malamaco Channel. For the people of Venice and the surrounding islands, Poveglia's depopulation was one event among many in the administrative life of a republic that was constantly managing its assets, its territories, and its populations in response to the pressures of trade, warfare, and epidemic. The island's evacuation would have been noted, registered in the consciousness of those who knew the lagoon well enough to notice the change in the island's condition, and then absorbed into the background of the lagoon's ongoing life. The channel kept moving, the tides kept turning, the signal post kept watching. The island remained exactly where it had always been, at the same distance from the Lido shore, at the same point along the navigational route between the interior lagoon and the open Adriatic, carrying in its emptied buildings the residue of 9 centuries of human habitation without any of the humans who had made that habitation what it was. The children who had been born on Poveglia in the years before 1379 grew old on the Giudecca. The knowledge of the island's particular channels and tidal patterns, the kind of knowledge that is built through daily practice over lifetimes and transmitted through families rather than through writing, would have lived on in them for some years after the relocation, and that as the generations turned, would have faded into the kind of half-remembered expertise that has no practical application anymore. Their grandchildren would have known Poveglia as a name, a story, a place their family had come from before the order arrived and the boats departed. Their great-grandchildren might not have known even that. The specific embedded knowledge of a place, the knowledge that belongs to people who have lived in it for centuries, does not survive the removal of the people who carry it. It goes with them, diminishes in the next generation, and is gone before the third. There is a specific kind of quiet that comes after a community leaves an inhabited place by direction rather than by gradual attrition. When populations leave a place slowly over generations because conditions have become difficult or opportunities have opened elsewhere, the departure is uneven and drawn out, the last inhabitants a dwindling remnant of what the place once held. The infrastructure deteriorates alongside the population, the maintenance work becoming too much for too few hands, the buildings giving way in proportion to the reduction in the people available to maintain them. But when a community is directed to leave within a specific administrative time frame, the place they leave is not in the condition of gradual abandonment. It is in the condition of a place that was working until it stopped. The buildings are intact. The fishing equipment is where it was last used. The communal spaces are in the state of a community that was present last week and is not present this week. The discontinuity is sudden in a way that gradual depopulation is not. This is the condition Poveglia entered in 1379. Not a slow decay, not a place diminishing over generations, but a place in full operational condition from which the operational element had been removed. The state's administrative use of the island would have introduced new human activity into that condition, but it was a reduced and functional presence, not a residential one. The buildings of the fishing community were not homes anymore, in the way that a building occupied by assigned staff is not a home in the same sense as a building inhabited by people who chose to be there because it was where they lived. The distinction sounds abstract. In practice, it is the difference between a place that is maintained with care because it is someone's own, and a place that is maintained adequately because it is the state's property, and negligence would have consequences. The Malamaco Channel continued to carry its traffic past Poveglia's western shore in the decades after the depopulation order. The vessels using it, fishing boats from the surrounding communities, trading ships moving between Venice and the Adriatic ports, occasional military vessels on their way to or from the Republic's eastern territories would have passed the island at the same distance from its shore that they had always passed, the same navigational relationship between channel depth and shore distance that the lagoon's geography imposed. From any of those vessels, the island would have looked much as it had looked to their predecessors. The signal post structure would have been visible. The channel between the island and the western edge of the passage would have been the same water it had always been. The difference was not visible from the channel. It was an internal difference, a difference in the quality of the human life the island contained, which looked from the water like no difference at all. The buildings of the old fishing community, standing in the post-1379 silence of their new administrative function, would have settled gradually into the specific kind of patina that inhabited buildings develop when the habitation is reduced and functional rather than domestic and generational. The small repairs that daily occupancy generates, the door that needs rehinging, the wall that has cracked slightly and needs pointing, the roof tile that has shifted and will let in water in the next hard rain. These repairs happen automatically in a place where someone lives because the person who lives there notices them and fixes them as a matter of course. In a state-administered installation, the repairs happen when they are reported and when the budget permits. The building stays functional, but it begins, slowly, to show the difference between maintenance and care. 9 centuries of ordinary life had made Poveglia what it was in 1378. The order issued in the following year made it something else, something that would continue to change, to be reassigned, to be used for purposes its original settlers could not have anticipated across the centuries that followed. The community that had built its daily existence in that particular location of the lagoon, between the Adriatic and the city that was becoming Venice, left behind the physical fact of the island and the invisible, non-transferable fact of their accumulated knowledge of it. The island persisted. The knowledge did not, except in the diminishing form carried by the displaced community on the geodeca and then over the generations, not at all. What persists on Poveglia from the period of its original settlement is not recoverable through documents alone. The documents tell a reduced version of what happened. The dates, the orders, the administrative reassignments, the military use, the relocation. What the documents do not hold is the experience of the place as it was lived across those 9 centuries. The specific sound of the channel on a quiet morning, the way the fishing boats were arranged along the shore at the end of a working day, the particular quality of community life on a small island that had been settled by people seeking safety and had held their families across hundreds of years of ordinary time. That experience is gone. What remains is the island itself, the water around it, the navigational channel alongside its western shore, and the long silence that began on the morning the last residents loaded their boats and made their way north toward the Giudecca and did not come back. The Venetian Senate's order had been practical. It had been compensated, at least nominally. It had followed a logic that made sense in the terms of the Republic's management of its lagoon territories and its military and administrative needs. None of those facts changed the particular quality of what Poveglia had been for the people who had lived on it, a place that was theirs, that they knew, that they had not chosen to leave, and that they left anyway, because the state that administered the lagoon had decided it needed the island for something other than a community's home. The buildings stood for years after they were gone, holding the shape of rooms that no longer had anyone in them to define what the rooms were for, their walls as solid as they had been the morning before the departure, carrying the silence of a working community's infrastructure, standing without its working community, waiting for the state's next set of uses to arrive. In 1776, the Venetian Republic issued a formal administrative designation that transformed Poveglia from an island of managed vacancy into a lazaretto, a quarantine station for ships and their passengers arriving through the southern approaches of the lagoon. The decree was a piece of civic infrastructure, not a sentence. Venice had been managing epidemic disease through its network of lagoon islands for more than 4 centuries by this point, and what the 1776 designation represented was the formalization of a function the island had already begun in practice to perform. The quarantine system of the Venetian Republic was among the most sophisticated public health administrations in Europe, built from hard experience and refined across generations of epidemic emergency. Poveglia was assigned a specific role within that system, and the assignment was practical, methodical, and in keeping with the accumulated institutional knowledge of a republic that had learned, at enormous cost, how to slow the movement of disease through its waters. The geography of the designation was not incidental. Poveglia's position alongside the Malamaco navigational channel, one of the 3 primary deep-water passages into the lagoon from the Adriatic, meant that ships arriving from the south could be intercepted before they reached the city. The island's western shore ran close enough to the shipping lane that vessels passing through the channel would have been in clear visual range of the quarantine facilities, close enough to make the observation mutual. A ship's crew, standing at the rail in the morning light of the southern lagoon, would have seen the island's buildings, its mooring points, and the figures of any quarantine staff on its shore. The message carried by that visibility was administrative in its nature, but unmistakable in its effect. This was the point at which the passage into Venice was governed, inspected, and when necessary, interrupted. The lazaretto stood at the entrance to the city, the way a threshold stands at the entrance to a house, marking where the outside ended and the inside began. The administrative framework that gave Poveglia its 1776 designation had roots that extended back more than 3 centuries. The earliest formal quarantine measures in Venice were developed in direct response to the catastrophe of the bubonic plague of 1347 and 1348, which arrived through the city's maritime trade routes and moved through the population with a force that restructured both the city's demographics and its institutions. Estimates for the mortality of that outbreak within Venice placed the death toll somewhere between half and 2/3 of the city's total population, figures that, held at the historical distance of 7 centuries, still carry a weight that numbers alone do not fully convey. A city that loses 2/3 of its people in a period of months is not the same city afterward. Its streets are quieter, its buildings contain less. The knowledge of how it happened and the fear that it might happen again becomes part of the institutional memory of the place, written eventually into policy, infrastructure, and law. Venice's response to the 1347 plague was not immediate systematic quarantine that came through a process of institutional learning that unfolded across the following decades and into the next century. The world's first formally established quarantine station, the Lazaretto Vecchio, was built on a lagoon island near Venice in 1423, 75 years after the first great outbreak. Its founding represented the distillation of 3 generations of accumulated experience into a permanent administrative structure, an island dedicated to the holding and monitoring of the potentially infected, separated from the city by the water that was itself Venice's most reliable barrier. The Lazaretto Nuovo followed in 1468, expanding the system's capacity and refining its protocols. By the time Poveglia received its formal designation in 1776, it was entering an institutional framework that was already mature, tested, and informed by centuries of epidemic record. The isolation period mandated for ships arriving at Venice's Lazaretto Islands was extended or shortened depending on conditions of origin and the presence of suspected infection. Ships arriving from ports known to be experiencing epidemic outbreaks were held for longer periods. Their passengers were confined to the island's holding buildings. Their cargo was exposed to air and periodically treated with vinegar and other substances believed to neutralize the emanations associated with disease. And their vessels were moored at the island's shore while the mandatory period elapsed. The mandatory period itself derived from the 40-day isolation practice that gave the quarantine system its name, quarantina, in Venetian dialect, referring to 40 days, though the actual duration was adjusted in practice according to the specific circumstances of each arriving vessel. What remained constant was the principle, the separation of the potentially infected from the uninfected population, maintained by the water between the Lazaretto Island and the city, for long enough to observe whether disease would declare itself. The mooring of a quarantined vessel alongside Poveglia's western shore would have produced a particular kind of suspended time for those aboard. The city they were traveling toward was visible in clear weather, its domes and campaniles identifiable on the northern horizon, the lagoon water lying between the island and the urban mass of Venice proper. The passengers could see where they were going. They simply could not go there. The days of the quarantine period would have passed in a state of enforced waiting, the administrative machinery of the Republic operating with impersonal thoroughness on the other side of the distance the ship could not yet cross. The Lazaretto buildings on the island's shore held the infrastructure of that waiting rooms, facilities, the presence of staff whose function was to observe rather than to treat, to count days rather than to intervene. The quarantine was a kind of calendar. When the days were complete and no illness had appeared, the ship could continue. The record would note that it had passed through. Venice's quarantine system did not emerge in response to a single outbreak and then remain static. It was tested, strained, revised, and expanded across a series of epidemic periods that extended through the 16th and into the 17th century, and the administrative knowledge accumulated through each episode was incorporated into the protocols governing the next. The islands of the lagoon became, through this process, a distributed infrastructure for epidemic management, holding facilities, burial grounds, and observation posts distributed across the shallow water between the Adriatic and the city, each assigned a specific function within the larger system. Poveglia's position in the southern lagoon, alongside the Malamaco Channel, made it a natural point of interception for traffic arriving from the south. Its designation in 1776 was the formal acknowledgement of a geographic utility the island had possessed for much longer. The 1630 outbreak was the last major plague epidemic to strike Venice, and its scale and the administrative response it generated are among the most thoroughly documented events in the city's institutional history. The epidemic killed approximately 46,000 people, a figure representing roughly one-third of Venice's total population at the time, and its management drew on the full capacity of the quarantine system, including operations conducted on and around the lagoon's isolation islands. Contemporary accounts of the 1630 outbreak describe disposal and quarantine measures that were intensive in their volume and systematic in their execution. Poveglia is cited in accounts of this period as one of the sites involved in that management effort, its infrastructure and its geographic position making it part of the operational response to an emergency that the city's public health apparatus was working to contain. The specific disposal practices applied during plague emergencies on the lagoon islands were driven by two overlapping necessities: the volume of deaths that epidemic mortality produced, and the prevailing understanding of how disease spread. In the medical framework of the period, disease was understood to travel through miasma, corrupted air arising from decomposing organic matter, and the prevention of further infection therefore required the elimination of that matter as completely and rapidly as possible. Fire was the preferred disposal method when fuel was available, because burning was understood to destroy the miasmatic source entirely rather than merely containing it. Bodies were cremated when the logistics of the emergency permitted. The fires built on the island's surface, the remains reduced to ash and fragmented bone, the material that could not be fully consumed, buried in layers with quicklime, and soil spread between the interments to suppress odor and neutralize what contemporaries described as the infectious emanations rising from the ground. The fires on Poveglia during plague periods were visible from the Malamaco Channel at night. Contemporary accounts note this as a matter of navigational and practical record. A low orange light on the water, rising from the island's surface, visible to the crew of any ship passing through the channel in the hours of darkness. The visibility was not incidental. Ships whose crews could see the fires on the Lazaretto Island were receiving information about the state of the epidemic emergency on shore and about the volume of work the island's facilities were managing. The light meant the quarantine cordon was holding, that the disposal operations were continuing, that the administrative machinery of epidemic management was functioning. For the crew of a passing vessel, the fires on Poveglia in a plague year were not a sight requiring interpretation. Their meaning was plain. The layered burial format used across Venice's quarantine islands during epidemic emergencies was a standardized practice rather than an improvised one, a method developed through the accumulated experience of managing plague mortality at volume, refined across multiple epidemic cycles, and applied consistently across the Lazaretto sites. Remains were interred in sequential layers, with soil and quicklime spread between each layer to suppress odor and to address what contemporaries understood as the infection risk posed by decomposing matter. The quicklime served a dual function. It was understood to neutralize the miasmatic emanation, and it accelerated the breakdown of organic material in the layers below it, reducing the biological and olfactory signature of the burial ground over time. The result? In a site where this practice had been applied across multiple epidemic periods and at large volume, was a soil environment layered with ash, fragmented bone, and carbon from cremation work. Its composition altered at depth by the sequential interment and treatment of remains over extended periods of time. The practical organization of this work on a quarantine island required a specific division of labor: people who moved the dead, people who maintained the fires, people who managed the burial layers and kept the records that the quarantine administration required. The records themselves were a significant part of how the system functioned. Venice's public health apparatus kept documentation of arrivals, quarantine periods, deaths, disposals, and releases with a bureaucratic thoroughness that reflected the Republic's broader administrative culture. The record of what happened on Poveglia during epidemic periods exists, at least partially, in the archival materials that have survived from the Republic's public health boards, documents that describe operational logistics rather than individual experience. It offers the kind of institutional record that maps the scale and organization of what was managed rather than the texture of what was endured. The quarantine administration's relationship to the island it managed was entirely functional. Poveglia was a tool, a geographic and infrastructural asset deployed within a larger system designed to protect the city's population from epidemic disease. The people who passed through its holding facilities were not, from the administration's perspective, individuals whose stories the record needed to preserve. They were cases to be managed, periods to be counted, conditions to be assessed. The documentation that survives reflects this orientation. It tells us how many ships arrived, how many passengers were held, how many deaths occurred on board or during the quarantine period, and what was done with those who died. It tells us less about what the waiting was like, what the people who came through the island's facilities carried with them in the way of experience, or what they thought about the time they spent in the holding rooms while the city they were trying to reach remained visible on the northern horizon. The medical understanding that underpinned the quarantine system, the miasma theory that explained disease as arising from corrupted air and organic decomposition, was not overturned within the period of Poveglia's active use as a lazaretto. The island operated within that theoretical framework for the entirety of its quarantine function, the disposal practices, the isolation protocols, and the application of quicklime, all reflecting a consistent and internally coherent set of beliefs about how disease moved and how its movement could be interrupted. The fact that the theory was incorrect does not diminish the practical effectiveness of the measures it produced. Physical separation of the infected from the uninfected population, enforced isolation during an incubation period, and the rapid disposal of remains all served to slow the spread of plague, regardless of the miasmatic explanation attached to them. The quarantine system worked within its limits because the physical measures it mandated were sound even when the reasoning behind them was not. The cessation of Venice's role as a major maritime trading center, the decline of the Republic's political independence following the Napoleonic reorganization of northern Italy in 1797, and the broader reduction in epidemic plague activity across Europe through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, all contributed to the diminishing operational importance of the lagoon's lazaretto network. The quarantine function at Poveglia continued for some years after the Republic's end, as the island's position alongside the Malamaco Channel retained its practical value for monitoring arrivals from the south. But the administrative intensity of the earlier epidemic centuries, the periods when the island's burial grounds were being actively used and its fires were visible at night from the shipping channel, receded. The quarantine station became a quieter place. The fires stopped. The island's southern soil held what it had been given. The specific soil chemistry that results from large-scale cremation activity sustained over extended periods produces a characteristic visual signature at the surface, a darkened coloration arising from high carbon content. The ash and char of combustion worked into the upper soil layers and persisting there long after the activity that produced it has ceased. On Poveglia, this darkening is documented in the descriptions of multiple independent observers who have accessed the island at various points since its administrative use ended, journalists, researchers, and urban explorers who have noted the visual distinctiveness of the soil in the island's southern and central zones as an immediately perceptible characteristic of the ground. The color is not subtle. It reads, to anyone walking across it with an awareness of the island's history, as direct physical evidence of what the place was asked to do across multiple centuries of epidemic emergency. The carbon content in that soil is not a contamination or a disturbance of the island's natural substrate. It is the natural substrate in those zones in the condition that centuries of use produced. The alluvial and lagoonal sediment that forms the geological basis of the lagoon's islands is a pale, sandy material, the accumulated deposit of the rivers and tides that built the lagoon over millennia. Where that sediment has been altered by the introduction of large quantities of ash and char from cremation work, the visual contrast between the modified and unmodified soil is significant and persistent. The carbon does not wash away easily. It does not break down at rates that would have cleared the record of the burial and burning work from the surface within the centuries since the last epidemic use of the island. The ground that visitors to Poveglia walk on, in the island's historically attested disposal zones, is the ground that was built by what was done there, and it continues to look exactly like what it is. The relationship between this physical record and the quarantine system's broader institutional legacy is one of material documentation, the ground itself as archive, preserving through its composition a record of the activity conducted across it. The written documentation of Venice's public health boards describes the operational parameters of that activity in administrative terms, the numbers, the protocols, the regulatory framework. The soil describes the same activity in physical terms, the volume, the carbon load, the depth of the altered layer. Neither record is complete without the other. The written record tells us what was intended and what was reported. The soil tells us, in its own way, what was done and how much of it there was. Together they constitute a documentation of the quarantine system's work at Poveglia that is more complete, if not more legible, than either source alone. The depth at which the altered soil layer sits below the present surface varies across the island depending on the degree of subsequent disturbance. Erosion, construction, and vegetation growth have all moved and redistributed material in the centuries since the island's active quarantine use. In some zones, the modified layer is close to the surface. In others, the intervening deposit of ordinary sediment, organic material from vegetation, and structural debris from the island's built environment has buried the burial record more deeply. The vertical structure of the ground in Poveglia's historically significant zones is a stratigraphic record of the island's different periods of use, each layer corresponding to a different phase of activity, the plague-era material lying beneath the quarantine period's surface, which lies beneath the institutional period's alterations, which lies beneath the present ground cover of grass, fig roots, and the slow accumulation of vegetative material that the island's closed decades have produced. What the quarantine system produced on Poveglia across the centuries of its operation was a particular kind of institutional landscape, a place designed for management, administered with bureaucratic precision, and marked at the level of the soil by the scale of what that management entailed. The holding buildings, the mooring points, the burial and burning grounds, the administrative offices where records were kept and passed along the chain of the Republic's public health apparatus. all of these were components of a functioning system, rather than expressions of anything beyond civic practicality. The quarantine station was not built for memory. It was built for function. The memory it has acquired in the centuries since its most intensive use is a consequence of that function, of the volume of what it managed, the nature of what it held, and the physical persistence of what it left behind. The fires on Poveglia at night during the plague years of the 15th through 17th centuries were a feature of the lagoon's visual landscape that the city living on its northern islands would have registered as ambient information. The quarantine station doing its work, the disposal operations continuing, the administrative response to epidemic emergency maintaining its operational tempo. The fires were ordinary in the context of what the quarantine system required. They were also, by any other measure, enormous, large enough to be visible from a significant distance across the water, large enough to mark the night sky above the island with a particular quality of light, large enough to leave in the soil a carbon record that remains visually detectable more than 4 centuries after the last of them burned. The scale of what was done on Poveglia during those epidemic periods is most honestly measured not in the administrative records, which describe operations rather than volumes, but in the soil, which holds in its altered composition and darkened color a direct physical account of the work that was asked of the island, and that the island, situated in the lagoon alongside the Malamaco Channel, with its function clearly assigned and its infrastructure in place, steadily performed. The Venetian Republic's quarantine apparatus was dissolved as an independent institution with the Republic's fall in 1797, its functions absorbed into the administrative structures of successive governing powers over the decades that followed. The Lazaretto network continued to operate in modified forms under French, Austrian, and eventually Italian governance, its purpose remaining essentially unchanged even as its institutional context shifted. Poveglia's quarantine role extended into the 19th century in attenuated form, the island continuing to serve as a stopping point and observation station for southern lagoon traffic long after the epidemic emergencies that had made it most intensively necessary had passed. The operational landscape of the plague centuries, the burning, the layered burial, the fires visible from the channel, was part of a history that the 19th century quarantine station administered over rather than added to, the ground already holding what earlier periods had deposited, the island's function continuing in a quieter key. The documented history of Poveglia as a quarantine station is not a history of horror or of institutional cruelty. It is a history of a civic system responding to a genuine and recurring emergency with the tools, the knowledge, and the administrative will available to it, a system that was, within the constraints of pre-germ theory medicine, as sophisticated and as effective as any in Europe. The mass burial, the cremation, the enforced isolation, and the fires visible across the water were all components of a response to epidemic mortality at a scale that required systematic management rather than individual attention. The quarantine system protected Venice. The evidence that it operated at the scale it did is preserved in the island's soil, in the archival records of the Republic's public health boards, and in the contemporary accounts of observers who described what they saw from the shipping channel during plague years, a low light on the water rising from the island, marking the point at which the passage into the city was governed, and the emergency was being managed, and the administrative machinery of the Republic was doing what it had been built to do. The soil on Poveglia's southern and central zones is darker than the surrounding lagoon sediment by a degree that multiple observers have found immediately perceptible. It has been darker for centuries. The carbon that altered it, was introduced across multiple epidemic periods, across generations of disposal and burial work, across the sustained operational tempo of a quarantine station positioned alongside one of the Adriatic's major navigational approaches to one of the Mediterranean's most significant cities. The record that the soil holds is not ambiguous about what happened in those zones. It is simply incomplete, the physical evidence of a large and documented historical process, still present underfoot on an island that has been closed to systematic investigation for decades, still carrying in its darkened color and altered composition the material evidence of the work that was done there, persisting in the southern lagoon's shallow light, the carbon settled in the ground, the record quiet and intact and continuing to hold. In 1922, construction workers arrived on Poveglia by boat and began the work of expanding what the island already held. The quarantine-era buildings along the northern compound were assessed, measured, and adapted. Walls were reinforced where the decades of vacancy had left them soft. New structures were added in the red brick characteristic of institutional construction in northern Italy at that time. Functional, undecorated, designed for volume and maintenance rather than for permanence or beauty. The island was being reassigned again, as it had been reassigned before, its inherited infrastructure made to carry a new institutional purpose. The psychiatric hospital that emerged from that construction would operate for 46 years, housing patients transferred from facilities across the Veneto region, staffed by doctors and nurses who arrived each morning by boat from the mainland, and in many cases returned the same way each evening. It was, by the administrative standards of its era, an ordinary institution in an extraordinary location. The decision to site a psychiatric facility on Poveglia was not unusual within the logic of early 20th century Italian institutional care. The prevailing medical and administrative framework of the period held that geographic isolation was both therapeutically sound and practically efficient for the management of patients requiring long-term residential treatment. Islands and remote rural sites were considered appropriate locations for such facilities throughout Italy and across Europe, separated from the general population not as punishment, but as a deliberate design principle, the distance understood as part of the treatment environment. Poveglia's existing buildings, its established infrastructure, its position in the southern lagoon with reliable boat access to Venice, all of these made it a practical candidate for adaptation. The decision required no unusual justification. The island was state property. It had buildings. It was isolated. It would become a hospital. The facility that operated on Poveglia between 1922 and 1968 has left behind a documentary record that is real but partial, patient intake records, staff rosters, administrative correspondence with the regional health authority. Some of this material survives in archival form, distributed across institutions in Venice and the broader Veneto region, some of it inaccessible, some of it never systematically cataloged. What survives describes an institution operating within the standard framework of Italian psychiatric care in the mid-20th century: large wards, long-term residential patients, a staffing structure organized around medical supervision and daily routine. The same general architecture of institutional life found in comparable facilities across the peninsula during the same period. It was not, in its documented administrative reality, a place that stood out from its contemporaries in any recorded way. The bell tower that rises from the island's northern compound was already old when the hospital opened. Its medieval stonework predates every other surviving structure on Poveglia by several centuries. Its proportions those of a Venetian campanile, rather than a working agricultural or military tower, suggesting it once served a community that was large enough and settled enough to build a structure of that kind. During the hospital's operational period, the tower was adapted for use in ways that are not entirely clear from surviving documentation. Its interior repurposed at some point for residential or administrative functions, while at its upper levels likely inaccessible to patients but present always as a visual reference point, visible from the wards, visible from the water, visible from the lagoon, as a marker of the island's inhabited core. It is still visible from the water today, its silhouette intact against whatever the lagoon sky is doing, its stonework holding its form, while the brick hospital buildings around it continue the slower work of coming apart. The bell tower is also the physical anchor of the most durable piece of folklore attached to the island. The story, encountered in various forms in Italian and international sources relating to Poveglia, concerns a doctor, unnamed in every version of the account, who worked at the psychiatric hospital during an unspecified period of its operation, and who, the story holds, conducted unauthorized procedures on patients. The procedures described vary between versions: experimental treatments, crude surgical interventions, operations performed without anesthetic or consent. The story's most consistent element is its ending, the doctor falling or jumping from the bell tower, the circumstances of the fall contested even within the tradition, the tower as the fixed point around which the account always resolves. In some versions, the doctor was driven to the tower by guilt, in others by something less explicable. The fall itself is, in every version, the point at which the story stops providing detail and begins providing atmosphere. What can be said about this story, held against the archival record, is that no version of it has been confirmed through documentary evidence. Searches of Italian medical records, regional legal archives, and hospital administrative files have not produced documentation of unauthorized experiments, formal investigations into patient treatment at Poveglia, disciplinary proceedings against named staff members, or records of a fatal incident involving a doctor at the facility. The story is present in Italian oral tradition relating to the island and was substantially amplified through paranormal media in the first decade of the 21st century, through television programs, websites, and documentary formats that treated the account as established history rather than as the piece of folklore it appears to be. Its absence from the archival record does not, on its own, settle the question of what may or may not have occurred inside the hospital over 46 years of operation. Absences in historical records carry their own ambiguity, but the story's presence in accounts of Poveglia is a cultural fact in its own right, a piece of oral tradition that has attached itself to the island, grown, traveled, and taken on something close to the weight of documented history, in the way the island is now understood by most people who encounter it. The bell tower's courtyard, at ground level, is still physically identifiable beneath the grass and the decades of accumulated leaf material that have worked their way into the paving stones. Photographs taken by visitors to the island at various points since the hospital's closure show the courtyard as a specific, architecturally coherent space, a rectangle of flagstones, the tower rising from one corner, the hospital's brick perimeter visible on the adjacent sides. The paving is broken in places, lifted by root growth and by the slow hydraulic pressure of lagoon damp soil working through its substrate over decades. But the space retains its form. It is recognizably the place the folklore describes. The gap between that physical specificity and the absence of documentary support for the story attached to it is one of the things that makes Poveglia's accumulated legend genuinely interesting to sit with, not as evidence for any particular interpretation, but as an illustration of how a place absorbs stories and holds them with the same tenacity it holds its older, more verifiable histories. The hospital closed in 1968. The specific administrative process of that closure, the formal decision, the patient transfers, the staff notifications, the regulatory framework that governed the facility's cessation is part of the institutional record, though not a part that has been widely examined or published in accessible form. What is documented is the broader context. 1968 was the year the Italian psychiatrist Franco Basaglia began the legislative and advocacy work that would eventually, over the following decade, dismantle Italy's large institutional asylums. The law that bears his name, passed in 1978, formally prohibited the construction of new psychiatric hospitals and set in motion the phased closure of existing facilities across the country. Poveglia's closure in 1968 preceded the Basaglia law by a decade, placing it within the early current of that reform movement rather than as a direct consequence of the legislation. Whether the hospital's specific closure was driven primarily by the changing policy environment, by the costs of maintaining an island-based facility, by the condition of the buildings, or by some combination of these factors, is not clearly established in sources available to the public. What is established through photography, through first-hand accounts from journalists and urban explorers who accessed the island in subsequent decades, is the condition in which the hospital was left. The closure was not a managed archival process. It was, by all accounts, closer to a cessation, a working day that did not continue. Iron bed frames remained positioned along the walls of the wards in their operational arrangement, as though the patients who had slept in them had simply not returned. Medical equipment was left on surfaces and in storage rooms. Furniture remained in the administrative offices. Filing cabinets stood open or were closed but not emptied. Papers remained on desks. In the treatment rooms and examination spaces, instruments remained where they had been placed, not in storage but in the immediate accessible positions of things still in use. The hospital did not appear from the photographic record to have been deliberately cleared before the last staff departed. It appeared to have been left. The ward photographs taken in the years and decades following the 1968 closure produce an effect that is worth describing in some detail, because it is distinct from the general visual record of abandoned buildings. Most abandoned structures lose their legibility slowly. The removal of furniture and fittings, the stripping of materials, vandalism and salvage all work to erase the evidence of specific function over time. Poveglia's hospital wards, particularly in the earlier documentary photographs from the 1970s and 1980s, before access became more widely known, and before urban exploration became an organized practice with its own culture and ethics, show something different. The specific functional arrangements of the rooms, the placement of the beds, the positioning of medical equipment, the organization of the administrative spaces remained largely intact. The abandonment was of a kind that preserved the institution's interior logic rather than dissolving it. Walking through those photographs, or looking at them closely in the way the journalists and researchers who have published them describe doing, gives the impression of a place whose daily life is simply paused rather than concluded. The ward is empty. Everything in it describes what the ward was for. The paint in those photographs is notable as well. The long strips peeling from the ceiling and upper walls of the wards, a consequence of the moisture that enters any unheated brick structure in a lagoon environment over years, curl away from the surface in shapes that are entirely the product of damp and time, the plaster substrate expanding and contracting through the seasons, the paint losing its adhesion by degrees. By the time the more widely circulated photographs were taken in the 1990s and early 2000s, the ceiling surfaces of many wards had lost significant portions of their paint layer, the pale institutional green or cream of the original finish, giving way to the gray-brown of exposed plaster, and in places, the darker tones of moisture penetration and mold growth. The windows in these same photographs are open, some of them, or at least lacking glass, and the quality of light entering the wards from the lagoon is the flat gray-white light of overcast days, diffuse and even, the kind of light that makes everything in the room equally visible and equally exposed, the lagoon light in those wards. The iron bed frames still in position along the walls, the long strips of paint descending from the ceiling in slow arcs. These are not dramatic details. They are the specific visual content of what a place looks like when it has been left to the incremental processes of moisture and time and the particular stillness of somewhere that no longer has a daily purpose. The photographs document those processes with the directness of photographs taken without theatrical intent by people who arrived on the island with a boat and a camera and the practical curiosity of someone who wanted to see what was there. The 2009 Ghost Adventures television episode, filmed on Poveglia, is a significant moment in the island's documented history, and not only for the reasons its producers likely intended. The episode was filmed with special permission. The production team received authorization to spend a night on the island, a permit that the Italian authorities have, by most accounts, granted to very few people before or since. The permission itself is documented. The episode was broadcast internationally and introduced Poveglia to an English-speaking audience that had no prior knowledge of the island. The phrase used in that broadcast to describe Poveglia, one of the most haunted locations in the world, was not, at that time, the island's established reputation outside of certain Italian traditions. It became so, internationally, largely through that episode and the secondary coverage it generated. Websites, documentary programs, YouTube channels, and travel writing that reference Poveglia's paranormal reputation in English almost universally cite or draw from the framework that broadcast established. The island's current international identity, the island no one visits, the most haunted island in the world, the island the Italian government refuses to open, is substantially a product of that single night of filming and its subsequent amplification through the media structures of the early internet. What that episode presented as evidence, recordings, visual phenomena, the accounts of the investigators during their overnight stay, belongs to the category of reported experience rather than documented fact, and the narration sets it there without dismissing it. Things were reported. The reports have been repeated. The island's recorded history and its physical condition are independently real and independently interesting, and they do not require the claims made in that broadcast to be evaluated as anything other than what they were. One team's account of one night in a particular location, presented in a format designed for a particular kind of audience. The island that existed before that broadcast is the same island that exists now. Its quarantine history, its plague-era burials, its 4 decades of psychiatric use, its 40-odd years of subsequent vacancy, none of that requires a television program to make it worth attending to. The furniture left behind in the hospital's administrative offices is worth returning to. Photographs taken in the first decade of the 21st century show offices in which the material culture of institutional administration is essentially intact. filing cabinets, desks, chairs, the occasional framed document, or notice still attached to the wall by a nail or a length of adhesive tape that has not yet given way. The papers on the desks have in some cases spread or shifted in the decades since the building was closed, moved by the slow air of an unsealed environment, by the infrequent presence of researchers and explorers, by the same lagoon damp that works through everything on the island over time. But the general arrangement of the spaces, the fact that these were working rooms, organized for the daily production of institutional paperwork, the correspondence and records, and schedules and incident logs of a facility housing patients, is visible and legible in every photograph. The institution's daily life is present in its furniture, in a way that the institution's own history is not yet fully present in any published account. There is something in those images, the filing cabinets, the desks, the papers, that the bell tower legend does not reach. The legend is about extremity, the doctor who went beyond what was sanctioned, the tower as the place where that excess ended, the island as the vessel of a specific and dramatic story. The administrative offices are about something different, and in a way something more difficult. The ordinary daily work of a facility housing, for 46 years, people who had been determined by the state to require institutional management. The records in those filing cabinets, whatever they contained, wherever they now are, would describe individual lives managed by institutional processes in a location chosen for its isolation within a framework of care that the subsequent decades of psychiatric reform would identify as deeply inadequate. The legend of the Tower Doctor is, in a sense, easier to carry than that. It gives the island's institutional history a specific villain and a specific event, and displaces the more diffuse and less narratively satisfying discomfort of what a psychiatric facility on a lagoon island between 1922 and 1968 would actually have been. The hospital's bell tower can be seen from several kilometers across the lagoon on a clear day. Its proportion and silhouette mark it as the oldest surviving structure on the island. Its medieval stonework, visually distinct from the brick institutional buildings that grew up around it during the 20th century, its outline unchanged by the decades of vacancy that have progressively altered the hospital compound's profile through roof collapse and wall deterioration. From the water, in certain lights, the tower appears almost clean against the sky, the same angle of stone and mortar it has presented to passing vessels for several hundred years, the same fixed point it was when the quarantine station was active, when the hospital was operating, when the last boat departed in 1968, and now the structures around it are in various stages of coming apart. The tower is not. The 1968 closure was not the end of any proposed future for the island. In the decades following the hospital's cessation, various plans for Poveglia's reuse were developed, proposed, and abandoned. A rehabilitation into a hotel and conference facility was discussed at one point. Agricultural use was considered and apparently trialed in limited form. In 2014, the Italian government made the island available for lease through a competitive tender process open to private bidders, with conditions attached requiring the preservation and restoration of the historic structures. A Venetian entrepreneur secured the lease but subsequently lost it following a legal dispute with the municipality. At the time of this narration's composition, Poveglia remains in state ownership. The Guardia Costiera continues to enforce access restrictions on the water around the island, and the buildings continue their slow, unassisted deterioration. The island sits in the southern lagoon, approximately 4 kilometers from the main Venetian cluster, visible from the Lido shore on clear days, its profile distinctive in the lagoon's flat horizon. The vegetation that has entered the hospital since 1968 has followed the building's own logic in a way that is worth pausing on. Plants establish first at the margins, the window frames, the broken roof sections, the exterior walls where soil has accumulated, and the angles between structures. From those margins they move inward, following light and moisture, the direction of each plant determined by the specific gaps in the building's envelope through which those elements can be reached. The fig trees that have broken through interior floors in several of the hospital's rooms did not enter from outside in the conventional sense. Their roots worked through the floor substrate from below, following water, and their growth above the floor level is the visible consequence of a process that began in the soil and worked upward through the building's foundation into the room. The tree in an abandoned ward is not the tree that happened to fall into a building. It is the building that happened to be in the path of the tree's growth. The distinction is not dramatic. It is simply the accurate description of what is happening and what has been happening in those rooms for the last several decades. The photographs of those rooms, the ward interiors with the fig branches moving through the window frames, the floor tiles buckled by root pressure from below, the iron bed frames still positioned along the walls, while the walls around them are slowly being dissolved by moisture and light, and the patient insistence of growing things are among the most widely reproduced images of Poveglia in the documentary and journalistic record. They are reproduced, usually, as illustrations of the island's haunted reputation, as evidence of the specific atmosphere the island carries. That is one honest reading of them. Another is simply what they document, a building, left alone for 50-odd years, returning through the action of water and light and biology to the condition of the landscape around it, its specific institutional history preserved in the furniture that remains and gradually obscured in the structure that is coming apart. The specific detail of the iron bed frames is one that recurs across multiple independent observers and photographers who have accessed the island at different times. The frames are described consistently, their positioning along the ward walls, their institutional regularity, the fact of their presence in rooms that have otherwise been substantially altered by decay and vegetation. The beds were not removed when the hospital closed. They were left in position. In the decades since, everything around them has changed. The ceiling above them has opened or deteriorated. The walls have lost their paint, and in some cases portions of their plaster. The floor around the frames has been lifted in places by roots. The frames themselves persist. Their presence in the ward is the same kind of quiet, specific fact as the darkened soil in the island's southern zones or the surviving stonework of the bell tower, a physical record of the place's history, still there, available to anyone who can reach the island and walk through the rooms. The last staff members who left Poveglia in 1968 crossed the lagoon to the mainland or to Venice by boat, as they had arrived, as they had been doing for the duration of their employment at the facility. The crossing would have taken them past the bell tower, visible from the water on the north side of the island as the boat moved toward the Lido or toward the Zattere. Whatever those individuals thought about the institution they were leaving, whatever the circumstances of the closure felt like from inside the process of it, is not part of the available record. What they left behind is the beds in the wards, the instruments in the treatment rooms, the papers on the desks in the administrative offices, the filing cabinets with their decades of patient records, opened or closed containing whatever they contained, remaining in a building that was no longer being maintained or monitored or heated or cleaned. The institution became a still life at some specific moment. The last door closed, the last boat engine audible, and then diminishing, and then gone, and the still life has been rearranged slowly, since then, by damp and root and time. The question of what happened inside Poveglia's psychiatric hospital during its 46 years of operation is genuinely open in the sense that it has not been systematically examined by researchers with access to the surviving records, and genuinely constrained in the sense that the dramatic version of events, the unnamed doctor, the unauthorized experiments, the fall from the tower, is a piece of oral tradition without documentary support. Between those two poles, there is a considerable amount of ordinary institutional history. Patients admitted, staff employed, daily routines maintained, records kept, the specific texture of life inside a mid-20th century Italian psychiatric facility on an island in the Venetian Lagoon. That history is in its own way more difficult and more interesting than the legend because it is more real and because its reality is not yet fully visible in any published account. The bell tower stands at the edge of that history, where the documented record and the oral tradition have been living together for long enough that separating them requires more care than is usually applied to the island's story. Its stonework is real. Its silhouette above the lagoon is real. The courtyard at its base, still flagged and still coherent, despite the decades of growth working through its edges, is real. The story attached to it may or may not have any basis in events that occurred on the island. The story's existence is its own kind of fact, cultural, not historical, but persistent in the way that stories attached to specific places tend to be persistent, outlasting the institution that generated them, traveling far beyond the lagoon. The hospital ward in the photographs from the years just after the closure is a room in which the quality of the light is the clearest thing, the flat gray-white light of the lagoon coming through the open window, the iron beds still in their positions along the walls, the paint descending in long strips from the ceiling, and the slow curves of something that has been separating from its surface for a very long time. The floor tiles intact, or mostly intact, the lines between them still regular, the evidence of the building's original construction still legible in every surface that has not yet been reached by moisture or by the roots working through from below. The room is empty. Everything in it remains. The light from the lagoon falls across the floor without preference for any particular part of it. The institution's daily life has become, in that room, a kind of residue, present in the arrangement of the furniture, preserved by the accident of abandonment, held in place by nothing more considered than the fact that no one came back to clear it away. That is the image the documentary record offers. The ward in the years after the hospital's closure, lit by the lagoon, the beds still in their rows, the building's slow return to the elements already underway in the ceiling and the walls, the fig tree's roots already beginning, somewhere beneath the floor, the long work of finding their way through. The soil on Poveglia's southern spit is darker than the ground around it, not dramatically so, not black against white, not char against sand, but darker, visibly, in a way that multiple observers, approaching from different directions and different decades, have noted using almost identical language. It is the color of earth that has received something it does not fully give back. The journalists who documented the island in the decade after its hospital closed noted it. The urban explorers who crossed from the Lido in small boats and photographed the overgrown compound in the early years of the century noted it. The researchers who came to take samples and run preliminary analyses noted it, and their notes said the same thing. The topsoil here is different, its composition altered at a depth and density that the usual processes of lagoon sedimentation do not produce on their own. What altered it was carbon, ash, the residue of cremation conducted at volume across extended periods, worked into the soil's upper layers by rainfall and root growth, and the slow cycling of organic matter over centuries, distributed throughout the ground rather than concentrated in any single location, because the burning that produced it was not single or located, it was ongoing, seasonal in the worst years, spread across the southern and central portions of the island, wherever conditions allowed and necessity demanded. The fires are recorded in contemporary accounts as visible at night from the Malamaco Channel, a low orange presence on the water's edge, the light recognizable to passing sailors for what it was. The soil that those fires left behind is still there. It sits under the fig roots and the broken paving stones and the collapsed outbuildings of the hospital complex, and its color is the color of what happened to it, and that color has not faded in 500 years. This is not a metaphor. The carbon content of organic material persists in soil across geological timescales. Ash mixed into earth does not dissolve or disperse beyond the range where it was originally deposited. It becomes part of the substrate, part of what the ground is made of, part of what future vegetation draws from, and what future water moves through. When observers describe Poveglia's southern soil as visually distinct, they are not describing an atmosphere or an impression. They are describing a measurable physical characteristic that has a measurable physical cause, and the cause is documented, and the documentation goes back to the 14th century. The bubonic plague arrived in Venice in 1347, and by 1348 had reduced the city's population by somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3. The numbers in the records are approximate because the records themselves were intermittently maintained by a civic administration that was losing the people who kept them. What the records do preserve is the response, the protocols that Venice developed with unusual speed and unusual administrative sophistication for managing both the living and the dead during epidemic periods. The lagoon's islands became part of that response early. Their geographic separateness made them practically useful. Their distance from the main island cluster made the separation of the sick from the well achievable in physical terms rather than just administrative ones. Poveglia sat in the southern approaches, close enough to the Malamaco Channel that ships moving toward Venice from the Adriatic passed within clear visual range of its shore, close enough to monitor, far enough to contain. The formal designation of Poveglia as a lazaretto, a quarantine station, came in 1776 when the Venetian Republic made official what the island had already performed across earlier epidemic periods in various informal and semi-formal capacities. By 1776, Venice's quarantine system was among the oldest and most developed in the world. The Lazaretto Vecchio, on its own lagoon island, had been operational as a formal quarantine facility since 1423. The protocols Venice had developed over those 3.5 centuries, mandatory isolation periods for arriving vessels, separate facilities for the sick and the merely exposed, systematic management of the dead, had been observed, adopted, and adapted by port cities across the Mediterranean. The 1776 designation placed Poveglia within that tradition as a southern checkpoint, its position on the Malamaco Channel giving it a specific navigational function. Vessels entering the lagoon from the south would pass it, would be visible from it, and if their health status required it, would stop there. The plague outbreak of 1630, the last major epidemic Venice experienced, and the one that produced some of the most intensive documentation of the lagoon's quarantine operations, killed approximately 46,000 people, roughly one-third of the city's population at the time. The accounts from that period describe the disposal operations with the specificity of institutional record-keeping, the layering of remains with soil and quicklime, the burning where fuel permitted, the management of what the emergency produced in quantities that the ordinary systems of burial were not designed to handle. Poveglia's name appears in accounts linked to that period's operations. The fires visible from the channel at night appear in those accounts. The soil that now underlies the island's southern zone carries in its composition the physical consequence of what those accounts describe. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in proximity to the island's known burial zones have returned results that researchers and documentary makers have cited as consistent with mass grave contexts. The technology produces a map of what lies beneath a surface that gives from above no clear indication of its internal structure. The readings showed stratified deposit layers and subsurface voids at depths and densities compatible with the kind of layered, volume-driven interment that the historical record attests. These surveys have not produced a formally published archaeological data set. The results exist in documentary archives and in the contextual framing of journalistic accounts rather than in peer-reviewed literature, which means they constitute corroborating evidence rather than scientific confirmation consistent with the historical record, but not established through the methodological framework that would make them definitive. The reason they have not been established through that framework is that the Italian government has not permitted the systematic archaeological investigation that would produce it. The Ministry of Cultural Heritage and its regional authorities have maintained strict restrictions on excavation at Poveglia, citing two grounds: the sensitivity of the site as a burial ground, which places it within the protections applicable to sites of significant human interment, and the structural instability of the built environment, which poses a genuine physical risk to any team working within or near the hospital complex. Both reasons are real, neither is hidden. The restrictions are bureaucratic and heritage management realities, when enforced with the ordinary mechanisms available to a government agency managing a sensitive site. The Guardia Costiera patrols the water around the island, and the landing restrictions that have kept the island closed to the general public since the mid-20th century remain active and enforced. The result is that the physical evidence of Poveglia's plague-era burial history, the darkened soil, the fragmentary remains that erosion and vegetation have brought to the surface in various locations across the island, the radar readings in the documentary archives, the contemporary accounts that place the burning and burial operations at specific locations over multiple epidemic periods, remains largely unexamined in the terms of professional archaeology. What is known from the surface and from what the surface gives up at its own pace, without excavation, without systematic survey, without the interpretive context that stratigraphic analysis would provide. The ground holds what it holds, and the ground has not been read. Fragmentary skeletal remains have been documented at or near the surface in various locations across the island by journalists and researchers who have accessed Poveglia at different points over the past 3 decades. Long bones, cranial fragments, teeth. These are not concentrated findings, not a single site where erosion has exposed a burial context, but distributed across the island's landscape in a pattern consistent with the diffuse distribution that emergency period cremation and burial at volume would produce. The remains arrive at the surface through the same processes that govern all erosion and vegetative disturbance: root growth, pressing upward through soft substrate, water moving through porous ground during high water events, the slow collapse of embankments along the island's irregular shoreline. The soil releases them without announcement. A journalist photographs what the ground has produced. The photograph enters the documentary record. The ground continues, behaves. These photographs exist alongside decades of aerial documentation showing the hospital compound's progressive structural deterioration, roof lines interrupted by gaps where timber has given way, interior spaces increasingly open to the sky, vegetation advancing through windows, and along wall tops from the 1990s to the present. The two categories of documentation sit together in the same archives: the surface finds and the structural decay, the bone at the soil, and the fig branch through the window frame, both of them evidence of the same basic process, a place continuing to exist without human maintenance, and time doing what time does to places left to it. The island does not require drama for this to be genuinely interesting. The process is interesting in itself, as a physical fact, as a demonstration of what persists and what does not, as a record of multiple layers of human activity compressed into a small, bounded, inaccessible piece of land sitting in a lagoon that is itself one of the most historically dense bodies of water in the world. The bell tower stands above the hospital complex's deteriorating roof lines, its stonework holding its form against the same erosive processes that have taken the softer brick structures around it. It was a medieval tower before it was associated with the hospital. It was a working navigational and ecclesiastical feature of an island that held a civilian population for 9 centuries before any of the institutional use began. Its current silhouette against the lagoon sky, the tower intact, the structures around it progressively giving way, is the image that photographs of Poveglia most often center, and it is an accurate image, a true description of the relative durability of medieval stone against 19th and 20th century brick construction, and also an image that carries its own quiet implication about duration. The tower has been there longer than almost everything around it. It will likely be there after most of what surrounds it has finished falling. Poveglia was first settled, according to the earliest written records, in 421 AD, the same year traditionally associated with the founding of Venice, when mainland populations seeking refuge from the instability of a collapsing administrative order moved out onto the lagoon's islands in small boats. It held a civilian community for 9 centuries. In 1379, during the War of Chioggia, the Venetian Senate issued an order compelling that community to relocate to the Giudecca. The island's residential life ended not by attrition, but by administrative decision, and the infrastructure it had produced, the buildings, the quays, the managed shoreline, was repurposed into something else: a checkpoint, an outpost, eventually a lazaretto, eventually a psychiatric hospital. Each institutional use inherited the physical form of what came before it, and adapted it, adding structures and removing others, but never entirely clearing the previous layer. The island's current landscape is the accumulation of all of them: quarantine-era walls standing alongside hospital-era brick, medieval stonework alongside Napoleonic fortification, fig roots pushing through floors that were laid over soil that was already centuries deep in ash and carbon before the first hospital patient arrived. The octagonal fort at the island's southern tip, the structure built in the early 19th century to mount artillery covering the Malamaco Channel, is structurally more intact than the hospital complex to the north. Its walls are stone, its form geometric and designed for durability, its purpose military, and therefore built to resist force from without. It does not have the same problem as the hospital buildings, which are brick and which have been absorbing decades of moisture and vegetative intrusion without anyone maintaining their walls or clearing their drains. The fort persists at the island's southernmost point, its octagonal form visible from the water, the Malamaco Channel moving alongside it as it has since the fort was built, and as it moved alongside the island's earlier structures long before that. Ships pass. The fort stands. The channel continues its movement between the Adriatic and the lagoon, carrying vessels that do not stop. The two land masses of the island are connected by a narrow isthmus and a man-made embankment, the ground between them low and in places waterlogged at the edges, water visible on both sides when the tide is high enough, the lagoon's horizon extending in every direction from the midpoint of that narrow connection. The isthmus is covered in grass growing up through cracked stone. It is the point where the island is most clearly two things joined rather than one thing continuous, most clearly a place assembled from its geography rather than naturally unified. Standing on it, in the photographs that capture it, in the accounts of those who have crossed it, the lagoon is present on all sides, the island's two sections extending away in opposite directions, the water and the sky filling the peripheral vision. It is a specific spatial experience, the experience of a narrow ground between open water, and the island offers it at its own center, at the joint between its two halves. The southern spit tapers toward the water at low tide, its shoreline meeting the shallow lagoon in a line of reed grass and exposed sediment. The ground here is uneven and waterlogged near its edges, the island's irregular boundary between land and water moving with the tidal variation of the lagoon rather than holding a fixed line. At low tide, more of the spit is visible, more of the darker soil, more of the irregular edge between the managed land surface and the unmanaged water. The reed grass grows at the margin. The sediment holds the impression of water that has recently receded. The lagoon sits level and gray or bright depending on the sky, extending south toward the Adriatic beyond the Malamaco Channel, extending north toward Venice, extending east and west toward the barrier islands that separate the lagoon from the open sea. From the water, approaching from the south along the Malamaco Channel, Poveglia appears as a low silhouette, the bell tower rising above the tree line, the octagonal fort visible at the southern tip, the hospital compound's roof lines partially obscured by vegetation that has grown up through and above them over the past 5 decades. The island is modest in scale, 17 hectares, roughly triangular from above, its dimensions comprehensible in a single extended view from a vessel moving at a reasonable pace. It does not dominate the lagoon, it sits in it, level with the water, bounded by the channel on its western side and the shallower lagoon on its eastern side, its low profile consistent with the horizontal character of the whole lagoon landscape, which extends in all directions without elevation, without the kind of topographic relief that would make any part of it stand out from distance. What gives Poveglia its distinctiveness is not its form, it is what has happened on it, and the fact that it has not been maintained or developed since what happened there ended, and the fact that the record of what happened there, the documentary record, the physical record, the soil record, remains substantially intact and substantially unread. This combination is uncommon. Most places where significant events occurred over long periods have been continuously inhabited and consequently continuously altered, each successive use changing the physical evidence of the previous one. Poveglia was depopulated in 1379 and has not held a residential community since. Its institutional uses were sequential rather than overlapping, and when the last one ended in 1968, the island was simply closed. The structures left in their working day condition, the vegetation allowed to advance, the soil left undisturbed beneath the advancing root systems of the fig trees and the elderberry shrubs. The physical record has been accumulating since the island was first settled, and it has been largely undisturbed since the hospital closed. What lies below the current ground surface has not been systematically examined. The radar readings suggest what is there. The surface finds confirm some part of what the readings suggest. The formal investigation that would establish the full picture has not been permitted to happen. The access restrictions that enforce this condition are active and ongoing. The Guardia Costiera maintains a presence on the water around the island. The prohibition on landing applies to the general public and has been applied consistently enough that the island's reputation as inaccessible has become part of how it is described in every account of the place. The island no one visits, the island you are not permitted to approach, the island visible from the Lido on a clear day and unreachable from the same distance. Journalists and documentary crews have obtained special permission in specific instances. Urban explorers have crossed by small boat and documented what they found before leaving. The island has been photographed extensively from the air and from the water. Its current condition is reasonably well documented in visual terms. Its subsurface record is not. The Italian government's position that the island's burial sensitivity and structural instability warrant the restrictions currently in place is not contested in the academic or heritage literature in any serious or sustained way. There is no active advocacy for excavation. There is no funded research program waiting for permission to proceed. The Ministry of Cultural Heritage holds the access question, and the access question is held in the same condition as most of the other unresolved administrative matters that surround Poveglia: filed, acknowledged, not progressed. The island waits on the lagoon in the way that bureaucratic questions wait in filing systems: present, specific, not forgotten, but not opened. The ground-penetrating radar results that exist in documentary archives are not definitive. They are consistent with what the historical record would predict: layered deposits, subsurface voids, patterns compatible with mass grave contexts, but consistency is not confirmation. What would confirm them is stratigraphic excavation by a qualified archaeological team working with the appropriate permits and under the oversight of the cultural heritage authorities. That investigation has not happened. The gap between what the physical evidence suggests and what formal archaeology has been permitted to establish is not a gap filled with mystery or conspiracy. It is a gap filled with the ordinary mechanisms of heritage management in a country with an unusually dense and complex archaeological patrimony and a regulatory framework designed to protect it. Poveglia is not a singular exception to a process that treats other sites differently. It is a site within a system that moves slowly, for reasons that are coherent, and the record it holds waits in the soil with the patience of things that have nowhere else to go. The hospital closed in 1968. The furniture remained. The medical equipment remained. The files remained on the desks and in the cabinets, the record of an institution's ordinary daily function, preserved not by archiving, but by abandonment, the cessation of activity before anyone had organized a removal. Urban explorers who documented the compound in the years and decades following the closure photographed iron bed frames still positioned along the walls of the wards, paint falling from ceilings in long strips, windows standing open to the lagoon light, the desks in the administrative offices still holding the paperwork of a working day that simply did not continue. The institution ended in the manner of a sentence interrupted, mid-word, structure intact, meaning suspended. The documents that remain, if they remain, if decades of moisture and organic growth have not rendered them illegible, constitute a partial record of what the facility was and how it functioned, separate from the folklore that has accumulated around it since the building passed from institutional use into the particular kind of cultural space that abandoned places with complicated histories tend to occupy. The folklore around Poveglia is extensive. The story of an unnamed asylum doctor who allegedly conducted unauthorized procedures on patients has no verified basis in Italian medical or legal archival records. It exists as oral tradition, amplified through paranormal media, circulating in the English-speaking world, primarily since a 2009 television documentary introduced the island to an international audience and attached the phrase, "one of the most haunted locations in the world," to its description. The phrase has been repeated so consistently since that point that it now appears in virtually every account of the island, functioning as a kind of established descriptor rather than a claim requiring evidence. The bell tower appears in the most durable version of the folklore as the site of a dramatic event involving the doctor, though this event has no confirmed documentary basis. The tower exists, the courtyard below it exists. The stone paving is still identifiable beneath the grass that has grown up through it. These are physical facts. The event said to have occurred within them is not established by any record that has been produced for examination. What the island holds that is established, the 17 centuries of documented human presence, the plague-era burial and burning operations attested in contemporary accounts, the darkened soil with its measurable carbon content, the surface skeletal finds documented by independent observers across 3 decades, the radar readings consistent with mass grave contexts, the formerly unexamined subsurface record sitting under the fig roots, and the broken stone is genuinely interesting without any folklore attached to it. A small bounded piece of land in a navigational lagoon that has accumulated the physical consequences of 9 centuries of ordinary community life, 4 centuries of epidemic disease management, and 50 years of psychiatric institutionalization, and has then been left alone for 50 more years while the vegetation advances and the soil holds its record, and the access restrictions maintain the gap between what is visible and what is confirmed. That is not a story that requires elaboration. It is the story as it actually stands. The fig trees are the most visible part of what the island has become since the hospital closed. They grew first through the cracks in interior floors, documented in photographs taken in the decade after the closure, the roots finding the gaps in poured concrete and tile and widening them slowly, the trunks rising through what were wards and corridors and administrative rooms, the branches spreading under roof lines, and eventually through them as the timber gave way. The fig has a specific kind of growth, aggressive and patient simultaneously, its root system capable of exerting consistent pressure over years and decades on surfaces that no single event would breach. It does not force entry suddenly. It finds the point of least resistance and holds there, and the concrete or the stone eventually accommodates the root because the root does not stop. The aerial photographs from the 1990s show the hospital compound's rectangular roof lines interrupted by dark gaps and by the canopy of vegetation rising through them from below. 30 years later, the process has continued. The gaps are larger, the canopy is broader. The building is progressively becoming the kind of structure that vegetation lives in, rather than the kind that humans lived in. The island soil in the southern and central zones is darker than the surrounding lagoon sediment. The hospital compound, in its northern section, is more open to the sky with each decade that passes. The bell tower stands above both conditions, its medieval stonework holding its form against the same processes that are taking the brick buildings slowly apart. The channel runs alongside the western edge of the island, carrying vessels that do not stop. The lagoon holds the island on all sides, its level surface extending to the barrier islands in every direction. The water the same gray or the same bright, depending on the sky and the season and the particular quality of the afternoon light. The research application that would permit systematic excavation sits somewhere in the Ministry of Cultural Heritage's administrative process, not progressed. The radar results that suggest stratified deposits and subsurface voids consistent with mass grave contexts sit in documentary archives, not formally published. The soil carries its carbon record in the way that soil carries things, without emphasis, without announcement, as part of what the ground is made of. Available to observation, available to analysis, if analysis were permitted, available to the root systems of the fig trees and the elderberry shrubs that are working their way through it from above. The island exists in the southern Venetian Lagoon, approximately 500 meters from the Lido shore. On a clear afternoon, it is visible from the Lido waterfront, the bell tower and the tree-covered compound, the octagonal fort at the southern tip, the low silhouette of the two land masses joined at their narrow isthmus. The Guardia Costiera maintains the restriction. The landing prohibition holds. The island sits there, visible and inaccessible, the distance between the Lido shore and Poveglia's western edge, close enough to observe, and not close enough to reach without crossing into waters where the restriction is enforced. 17 hectares, 17 centuries of documented human presence, the soil its particular color, and the color its particular cause, the fig roots pressing upward through the floors of rooms that were last used by people who did not choose to leave anything behind because they did not know they were leaving for the last time. The radar readings filed in a documentary archive, the skeletal fragments arriving at the surface at the pace of erosion, slowly, in whatever season the soil decides. The channel moving alongside the island's western edge, the ships passing, the water continuing its movement between the lagoon and the Adriatic. The Venetian Lagoon at dusk settles into a particular quality of light, horizontal, diffuse, the sky and the water finding the same register of gray or gold, depending on the season. The low islands and the distant barrier reefs, barely distinguishable in the middle distance from the water that surrounds them.